You can just turn the camera. Could you guys speak there? Not in front of the camera.
Just like.
Wait. Oh. Okay. Oh wait, you want me to turn it fully like that, is it?
This.
But you want to be standing?
No.
Okay, alright.
Okay. Thank you very much to the Prime Minister to introduce a case on the side of opposition. We call upon leader of opposition.
I think it's unfair for government to say that in a world, in a post-conflict world where people are traumatized, where people are extremely heightened emotions, they're likely going to bother about things like remorse. I think likely without a proper governing like neutral body, I think these decisions that are made and these people within its courts itself. In the Gacaca courts itself are likely going to be extremely emotional. They're likely going to use the fact that they're very recently traumatized to and make unfair decisions. I think that's where our case comes in then. I think then this is important for two reasons that the opposition will be posing to you. Firstly, I think it's just about justice and fairness. But secondly, it's just about the practicality and about the future development of the nation as a whole and why likely it's going to be far worse on their side of the house. I think, okay, then let's talk about the comparative on our side of the house. I think the official tribunals are likely going to happen for everyone on our side of the house, whether it's low ranking or high ranking militants. So it's probably gonna be happen through like the ICC or a proper court system where you have a neutral actor like using a proper legal system and a proper legal code to be able to make these decisions as to how these people are going to be punished later. But yeah. I think then you're also probably only going to be punished once on their side of the on our side of the house, whereas on their side of the house they have to defend the fact that because the info site says that these official tribunals still exist, then it's likely to be true that they will probably be punished twice on their side of the house. On their side of the house. But I think then what exactly is the Gacaca? So finally, what exactly? Okay, this brings me to my before that the point. 3, 2, point. Okay, no. Yeah. Probably someone within the community itself.
Really?
And that is precisely why it's bad. Okay, then this brings me to my first argument then on the principle of fairness. I think the problem with the idea of this Gacaca model is that not every post-conflict state is one that has an oppressor and oppressed, right? Oftentimes these are two parties that are actively fighting against each other. Even if it's like one party that starts this, oftentimes it is both parties like dragging this conflict out and not wanting to like come to a compromise, which is the reason why these conflicts oftentimes go on and have a lot of or a lot of victims in the first place, right? But then the second layer to this is also just that justice is not always right because of this, right? Because oftentimes, because of the fact that you're filled with vengeance, because of the fact that you're filled with so much hate and emotion for the other side, you're likely going to disproportionately punish them. You're likely going to want to give them the worst possible punishment in the first place because of the fact that you are a biased actor at the end of the day. Which was, I think, on Gulf side of the house, what they have to defend then is why exactly is it justified for a biased actor to be like making these decisions or to be making this hard, like to be like allowed to be deciding on how harsh a punishment should be for like these people, right? But I think more importantly, then it's also just the fact that this is likely going to be double jeopardy, like, and punishment, right? Because of the fact, and this is like just very easily unfair. And also, just another layer to this is that oftentimes these Gacaca courts are likely going to punish the lower ranking militants, mainly because of the fact that these are likely the militants that are most proximate to like the people on the ground, and these are likely the people that these are likely the militants that the people on the ground see or these communities sees and want to punish because of the fact that they feel emotional against them. But the issue with this then is that oftentimes these lower ranking militants are given very strict orders and oftentimes are forced into these situations where they have to kill people or whatever because of the fact that they are forced into like I don't know, joining military, getting drafted, or like it's that or them dying on the field. It's oftentimes them having not having a choice, not having the ability to say no to their generals when these generals give them inhumane orders. But I think then these lower ranking militants are likely the people that are gonna be the ones that are gonna get prosecuted in these like Gacaca courts because of the fact that they are most like proximal, right? I think that is just this unfairness and this disproportional of the way they are likely going to get punished if this higher ranking militants just get punished in the ICC and like may not get as harsh of a punishment, right? But the second argument then is on the practicality and why on our side of the house you just get better long-term impacts, right? What's the case? I think it's very simple. The point of this entire thing is to make sure that this past conflict doesn't happen again, is to make sure that you heal from this past conflict, is to make sure you're able to redevelop your nation, is to make sure that that you are able to actually maintain the peace. But the issue with this then is the second in which you know that your military you know that this system itself was one that was unfair. You know that your neighbor or like the person in like the opposing like community to you literally like is the reason why the people within your community is like facing extremely hard punishment. It's the second in which you feel a sense of injustice. It's the second in which you feel some level of unrest within the community because but the issue with this is that you need to exist within this community itself. You need to be able to like rebuild this community, and this is not able to happen the second in which you never actually get a proper like punishment. You never actually get a sense of fulfillment from the way the conflict ended. You are never actually able to work together to like keep this nation going. But I think more importantly, it's because you build a sense of hostility within these people, within the government, within these communities itself. You keep the tension going because of the fact that they feel like there was never an end, there was never closure to them because they feel like the punishments were unfair and the punishments were unjust, the punishments were disproportionate, right? But the flip then is just using things like facts and neutral actors to make this decision, which is just far better. It's too late. Okay, what this means then is they're more likely to accept these decisions. They are more likely to get some level of closure or some level of acceptance towards these punishments made, but also just less hostile towards these other communities, right? What this means then is like how this happens is probably just things like making sure that the facts are right, making sure that the decisions made were actually things that actually happened instead of like I don't know, fake testimonies or testimonies that were heavily exaggerated because of the heightened emotion, right? But then victim testimony is extremely important, and it being cross-checked is extremely important because that's when you can actually verify these claims are true. You can actually verify that these claims made are accurate and not exaggerated to the point in which like it harms like the fairness of the trial, right? But the reason why this is extremely important then is because of the fact that you need to work together towards like building the nation, but it also just reduces the chance for like future conflicts, right? We've seen time and time again how hostility within different communities has led to more conflicts in the future, especially in post-conflict states, right? Things like the May 13 incident that happened because of the fact that people were extremely hostile against each other are extremely harmful, extremely possible things that will happen the second in which you don't actually get a proper closure, but the second in which you feel like these things are unfair. For all these reasons, for the betterment of nation building, for a more fair sense of legal trials, opposition.
Alright, thank you very much to the leader of opposition. To continue the case on side of government, Deputy Prime Minister.
Is about a genocide. And when I say the word genocide, I want you to think about the Palestinians who are dying because the IDF is bombarding them. I want you to think about the extermination of the Jews in the Holocaust, the eradication of the Bosnians in the Yugoslav wars. These are people, although they have been accused of crimes, this is just legal jargon for he did it and we just need to prove it in court. What we're saying is that we need to find as much evidence as possible from the lower ranking people so that we can convict people in these official tribunals. And secondly, we just think more information is inherently good for society and for nation building. I'll weigh why that is the utmost priority, even if justice was proven, which I don't think it was, this was not in priority in this debate at all. I'll give you one call out because I don't think they've proven justice, but even if they have proven justice, I'm unsure as to how this results in more nation building in the future. Sure, we get a fair verdict for a war criminal. Who cares about that war criminal? Because I'll argue to you how an accusation of a war criminal probably already means that he's likely guilty. Okay, first response. Their model is this official tribunal will likely be a neutral actor. Let's question whether this is true. Because when I asked the question, what is the race of the judge in the official tribunal? She said, well, it's the race of the affected communities. This means in the Rwandan genocide, the official tribunal, if it's a Hutu administrator who killed a Tutsi, the person who is adjudicating will be a Tutsi who would obviously also be an emotional person. This means that even just if justice was important, the same mechanism that they rely on for justice was not going to be fair at all because these judges would have still been emotional. But let's take them at their best. Let's say judges, even though his brother was literally killed by the oppressor, he could just put that all behind him. I just don't think that this is really the best way to move forward, because even if you get the most justified verdict possible, it will result in worse outcomes. I'm just reiterating the strategy on Gov is just to say that justice was never an important part in this debate. Let's deal with their bulk of the case. They're arguing it's unfair and it's emotional and disproportionate and double jeopardy. The first question I want to ask here is it really disproportionate? To be accused of a war crime, you need to have suspicion of being an accessory to a war crime. This is the legal standard even in the ICC and is used in all of the lower courts whenever we're trying war crimes. This means that a journalist who wrote the propaganda machine for the oppressors could be suspected of a war crime. This means the person who turned on the flick for the gas chambers could be suspected of a war crime. The person who drew the line in the sand for the firing squad to shoot a bunch of Tutsis could be suspected of a war crime. This means that you cannot rely on the assumption that I was just doing things because the oppressor told me to, because you were an accessory to the crime. But unfortunately, in the tribunal, you could make that legal argument. You could say, well, I just was following orders. But we'd argue that that is a horrible argument, but it will stand in these courts. And we think that it's given that both sides of the house, these courts are relatively compromised. The most important thing in this debate is fact-finding. The second question I want to ask here is, I really disagree that people will, that these people were forced to do what they were told. Because there are plenty of Nazis who actively, broke the chain of command, and they got lighter sentences in the ICC too. So that is really not a good defense. Lastly, emotional. I don't really think that's a problem. Everyone's emotional. They already consider to the context that people have been affected. So it will be really difficult to even find anyone who isn't emotional, even if you have a tribunal on that side of the house. Is that right?
Yeah, so the Nazis, as you just claimed, literally could not claim the superior order's defense. Because in as much as the bosses told them to do bad things, they were still responsible for the actual action. Isn't that justice?
Yeah, that is justice, and you could have proven that in both courts. In fact, I'll resolve this in this clash. So our clash on fact-finding, I think, outright wins the debate because we argued that this is less barriers to victim testimony in these Gacaca courts because there's no cross-examination and is entirely voluntary. The second tenet to our case is that there will be more lenient sentences because people are going to likely accept more responsibility because that's the purpose of these courts. When these criminals accept responsibility, they have to literally say, I killed these people and this is the way I did it. I wrote these articles. I turned on the gas chambers. This means that you're more likely to get closure on our side of the house for these victims if justice was important. But secondly, the more important thing here is that we get more evidence of the things that these people have done. And this evidence is crucial in every single part of society, even if it was in the superior courts on that side of the house. Because the admissions of the people who have done the war crimes could be used as testimony in these tribunals in the future. So if this was the mechanism on that side of the house to get justice, if a person that I told to turn on the gas chamber said I told them to do that, we think it's more likely for these people to get convicted even in their best case. Okay, now on an argument on how we get post-conflict recovery. So genocide, as they concede, and most conflicts are between two organizations. I don't think it's between two people. And that's because when the Hutus shot the Tutsi official that kick-started the genocide war, they didn't ask for a vote from all of the Hutus people to make that decision. They just did it anyway. And that's because it was the militia that was increasing the genocide between the Hutus and the Tutsis. We're going to argue that in a full trial, you immortalize the genocide because you allow people to continuously make arguments for sides that are inherently morally bankrupt. Lawyers will pick sides, and the legal case is, we didn't do it, and even if we did, it's not my fault. And this is quite a decent argument in courts, and it has stood up in most courts, and therefore you don't get accountability. But this argument is more than just accountability. It proves the pragmatic impacts of trial. When you have a full trial, and you force people to be on the defensive, these people will mobilize their respective echo chambers. There'll be protests on the streets to fight for the Hutus or the Tutsis. But secondly, you increase rhetoric. Warlords who felt that their leader was unjustly captured will then increase more rhetoric and increase friction. The reason why this is important is because this fractionalizes the nation-building process. We need people to work together in government, in the administrative level. But more than that, we need people to work together in politics. We really don't want the inception of the country to be one of division. We need to know who to blame. This person was the one to blame. Therefore, every Hutu who did not play a part in this genocide is innocent and therefore should be treated as a human that is not complicit in the genocide. For all those reasons, we take this split.
Thank you very much to the Deputy Prime Minister. Continue the case on side of opposition. Deputy Leader of Opposition.
So I want to clear up at the top of the speech. The first is the context of a post-conflict state, like the genocide post-Rwanda. We think this is likely to be a situation where society is extremely fragile and there's going to be very high tensions on both sides. And I think that means that any kind of interactions between different races is not likely to lead to a constructive outcome, especially in the absence of any characterization or likelihood analysis that comes from this particular gov bench. The second thing I want to clarify, as per the info slide, this Gacaca court system is not going to be a substitute for a formal tribunal. That means to say a formal tribunal, whether it be the local courts or the ICC, is something that those guys on that side of the house had to defend as well. Meaning to say, they cannot say that all of the processes of cross-checking and forcing victims to share stuff is a bad thing, because those things exist on that side of the house as well. Opposition doesn't support having a secondary judicial process that meets out extra legal punishment and worsens the tension in an already fragile state. Meaning to say, this debate is about the exclusive value of this additional court process and whether the community involvement in this particular reparative process leads to better outcomes or worse. Our claim on opposition was that it is, one, incredibly unjust, but secondly, worsens those tensions in society in an incredibly worse ways. The first thing I want to establish then in this speech is why these formal tribunals are very likely to be fair. And I'm just going to do this because I didn't expect Gov to argue against formal tribunals, okay? Like in the case of Nuremberg trials, the Tokyo trials post-World War II, or the ICC tried Joseph Kony and child soldiers, or the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad that's currently awaiting trial post-extradition from Russia. These are examples of judicial processes that are trying dictators and people who have committed crimes against humanity. There are three structural reasons why these courts are very likely to be fair. The first is that they are adjudicated by judges who are legally trained, who are fair, who have an understanding of the rule of law. These are people who have studied for long periods of time and they want to place blame because on that side of the house, the average person wants to place blame the bad guy for everything, whether they drew a line for the firing squad or not, and that's why that's likely to not be very fair later. That's why they're likely to blame them for everything. We think judges who are trained in the rule of law are likely to go through a fact-finding process and make sure that any kind of punishment is proportionate to the degree of intent and guilt and culpability of that particular person. You're not likely to get that in the counterfactual. The second is that these legal processes have a lot of checks and balances. So we have appeals mechanism, which is an incentive for judges to follow judicial process to make sure they don't screw up the system and then this decision get tossed on appeal. They also have discovery processes where lawyers are allowed to go through evidence from the other side and they're forced to disclose this. If not, their case is again going to be thrown out. You have rules and doctrines like the fruits of the forbidden tree, like witness protection, that prevent you from accessing illegally gathered evidence to ensure that this trial is carried out in the fairest and best way possible and to prevent misrepresentation and misplay on both sides of the house. But thirdly, this court is likely to be disconnected for this community, which means they are not likely to be affected by emotion. They are likely to be fair and impartial, at least like even if the Syrian civil war and the opposition is currently in power and they assign the judges to that court. The court is legally separated from the executive and therefore there is a degree of separation, which means they're not likely to be affected by emotion and political incentives. But secondly, even if that's not the case, they're likely to be perceived as fair, especially involve international people in these tribunals. That's why this court system is likely to be very, very good. Why then does the Gacaca trial become likely to be unfair? Later, we explain 3 reasons why this is not going to be good. The first is that this is likely to be double jeopardy and double punishment. This means that after the trial has determined that because you're responsible for the genocide of 2 million Jews, additionally, the Israeli Israeli society is going to say, on top of that, you also stole my cooking stove and I want reparations from that. We think this is likely to be additional punishment on top of that tribunal. If that's not the case, this GAT team has not explained how this dual court system is going to work, which means that not just you are punished for this initial crime, you are punished again by that community, and that's not likely to be good. Second, this is likely to be perceived as unfair because you are from this very community, because the Hutus committed massacres against the Tutsis, and now the Hutus presumably are in power, the Tutsis presumably are in power now and are going to be trialed by the other side that committed genocide against their family members. I'm not sure why that particular community interaction is going to be good. So you can have victims sharing their stories on your side of the house, but it's deeply unclear to me why these victim stories are going to be met with compassion and not going to be met with anger from the other side. That actually you are the one responsible for causing all these things in the first place. Like in the May 13 incident, Malay points finger at Chinese, Chinese points finger at Malay. There was not a positive resolution from that, and the government tried to blot it out of our history books rather than trying to seek reconstruction. It is likely to be perceived as unfair. That in itself is the reason for us not to do it. Why then do we actually get more justice? For all of the reasons I explained why this court process is likely to be good, which means they're likely to educate things, likely to do fact-finding missions, likely to explore evidence and discovery. It is not clear to me why victims cannot share stories on our side of the house. I think it is good that victims go through a cross-checking process to make sure that the claims they are making are backed up by evidence so they don't lie about things that's later discovered, and those kinds of processes are then perceived as unjust. I think this means that you're more likely to get proper adjudication on our side, which you're more likely to get justice on our side. Justice is particularly important because in post-conflict situations where very high tension between different kind of races, it is important for us to know who did what and that the person who actually committed those crimes are actually being punished for the things that they are being accused of and not punished for things that they are not guilty of. This is the only way for us to get reparations for victims down the road. And I will point out that the reason why Germany has to pay reparations to the rest of Europe, to Israel, is because of the Nuremberg trials and because the evidence that the courts collected as to what the Nazis did. The reason why Japan pays reparations to the rest of Southeast Asia is because of the Tokyo trials and the evidence that was collected. It is deeply unclear why alternative mechanisms to get reparations on their side of the house is going to be functional or get similar kind of efficacy. That is why justice is important, for people to feel that justice is done, for people to feel and actually receive tangible outcome as a result. Yes?
Your case is contingent on the impartiality of these tribunals. Don't you defend the local courts too, and isn't that also compromised?
One, the local courts are separated from the executive. These are judges that are trained, they are not likely to be part of that conflict in the first place. Secondly, we're happy to defend an international process like the Nuremberg trials, like the ICC, for example, in cases where the local courts are unable or unwilling to prosecute. These are all reasons as to why these judges are systematically more likely to be fairer than the alternative, which you, by the way, have to defend as well. Lastly, how best do you protect victims and get long-term reconstruction? Because a large part of the Gus case revolves around information and funding. They say it is voluntary, there's no cross-checking, so people are going to talk about it. You then expect these criminals to confess to crimes that they committed in the hope the community is going to forgive them, and the hope that this is likely to lead to a more constructive society at the end of the day. It's just not clear why this is going to be the case. This group of people have every incentive to lie, to diminish their role in the action, and because the tribunals also happen in your world, it is likely that this could turn evidence for you in the future. Comparatively, the Nuremberg trials and this trial process also have discovery and fact-finding processes, which means that information is symmetric on both sides of the house. The difference is that your side of the house had this particular interaction that is likely to raise tensions and to worsen those post-conflict resolutions for longer periods of time. We support justice. We support removing it from the communities that are most likely to make those things worse.
Thank you very much to the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Summarize the case on the side of government, government wins.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think the most important thing in this debate panel is what's going to happen after the conflict. It is the process of nation building that matters the most in this debate, not the process of justice, and we're going to prove why the process of justice necessarily dilutes this process in the first place. But first clash of today is on the process of nation building and what it looks like on both sides of the house. First, we told that we're more willing to trade off like a somewhat lenient but still harsher punishment in exchange of getting information, and we've proven to you how this information is necessarily valuable and why it's something that opposition does not have simply because people have an incentive to destroy this information in the first place. So the question in this debate then becomes, how valuable is information? We think that information, number one, prevents harmful rhetorics, and number two, prevents distrust among communities. Everything that's particularly valuable in a fractured world, in a fractured post-conflict nation, where society is at the brink of collapsing on itself, and where peace is merely temporary. So we think that nation building is so important because it relies on truth, it relies on the form of information that you're able to get, and we think that because these countries rely on need economic upliftment, all of those things after war, and we think that because there's a certain amount of transparency on our side of the house, they're far more likely to get that when, as opposed to a world where the truth was hidden away in the first place simply because criminals on the other side of the house have an incentive to destroy the evidence. So then, what does opposition then tell you? They think that nation building is going to be stunted because there's an increase in tension because people feel that their punishment is disproportionate. But the response to this is that if you're a war criminal and you have done wrong anyway, the punishment on our side is still going to be based off the amount of remorse shown. That is to say that if you don't show any remorse for committing a crime, chances are your punishment is going to be far graver in the first place. That's to say that all you need to do is admit some form of guilt and show remorse for your actions on our side of the house. That means to say that you'll be somewhat spared from the system itself, and we think that's far more likely to reduce tension on the side of the house. But second, we think that disproportionate punishment only happens when there is a lack of information. And this is something that is going to happen in the opposition side of the house. Why is that? We think that when there's a concealment of evidence, when evidence is destroyed, we think that punishment then becomes disproportionate because not only is the perpetrator either unable to prove their guilt, or we think that because there's no evidence, we think that the courts are more likely to rule against them in the first place. That's to say that as long as there exists some form of information outside of the house, we think that we are able to prevent disproportionate punishment from happening in the first place. So then, what then does the second clash in this debate look like? We think that it boils down to the process of justice. So the opposition tells you that they want a neutral actor with something that looks like ICC that will be very fair because of all the legal training. Sure.
Do we not know what happened to the 2 million Jews in that concentration camp under the Nazis?
We know that, but there are also other things that happened to them, like how Jewish children were stolen from their family, and those kind of records were things that were erased because they were small things that happened, but still proximate to people on the ground. You might not care that 10 people from a random village in Africa were slaughtered, but the people from that village care, and those are the kind of information that goes unnoticed on your side of the house because it's small and easy to erase. So So back to what I was saying, they want the ICC as a neutral actor, but we think that first response to this, the court process in official tribunals takes very long. We think that the legal process is one that's going to take like months or years, and we feel like this is the amount of time that these post-conflict nations cannot afford to wait for, simply because they are in a bad state, right? So what this looks like is right now is that you need to fix your country, you need to move on from the conflict, and we think the official tribunals are going to take away a huge amount of time simply because of all the legal jargon that exists, necessarily blocking the process. But second thing, to then point out is that tribunals are for high-ranking officials anyway. If opposition wants to prosecute small criminals, like what they said in LO's speech, that is to say that it's very unlikely that all of these small cronies are going to ever make it to the huge war tribunals that are specifically reserved for high-ranking generals or high-ranking militias. That is to say that small-ranking people still need to be prosecuted at the end of the day, and we think that's far more likely to happen on our side of the house. And how should these courts system on our side of the house? But how is this then important? We think that because of these small ranking criminals still do commit certain forms of harms that's proximate to the community on the ground itself. For example, things that happen in small villages that nobody cares about. But we think that because we are able to prosecute these kinds of cases on our side of the house, we are able to bring victims closer, and they are going to feel more hurt and more proximate to their side of the house, because the harms that were inflicted upon them is still something that's proximate to them but might not matter in the greater scheme of things on opposition side of the house when they choose to only prosecute high-ranking militias. So that's to say that we are able to guarantee a process of justice for lower-ranked people on our side of the house, because they still need to be prosecuted as well, and there's something that's not going to be guaranteed on opposition side of the house. But then the second thing that I want to tell you is that they believe that biased actors are going to screw over the legal process. But then LO tells you that official tribunals are still going to be the race of the race of the judge will be of the victim itself. So that's to say that they already contradict their point of the case because they don't necessarily prove how this trial will be impartial when you as let's say race A is going to judge a case where race B killed everyone from race A. You will obviously feel very offended, and we think that you are not going to be as impartial either. But then the second thing is that even if you are a neutral actor, chances are you are not proximate to the amount of harms that happen on the ground. That's to say that if you're a white man in the court in The Hague, like 6,000 miles away, you're not really going to know the amount of suffering that both sides will have to go through in the conflict itself. That's to say that we believe that even if your actors are neutral, they do not really care at the end of the day. And what these victims need, panel, is to be heard. And what we think that being heard is the victims matter the most in this post-conflict states. And we think that a more neutral process means you necessarily trade off people being heard as to a fairer process for these war criminals in the first place. But then the next thing that I tell you is that double jeopardy exists. But we think that this is highly unlikely, because as long as you don't show up to court in the ICC and you are prosecuted in our world, we think that chances are you will still be spared from the second jeopardy that's going to happen to you eventually. But then second, they tell you that they can still share stories on their side of the house. But we think that the problem in this debate then becomes that these stories become an excuse for people to escape accountability because it's seen as a plausible argument in cases like the ICC. And what this means right now is that but even if these stories were true, you are facing a white man in the court. You are not telling this directly to the victims, which is something that we are able to guarantee on our side of the house. That is to say that these stories will never, at the end of the day, feel as proximate from the perspective of the victim in the first place, because the war criminal is not facing them. The war criminal is not engaging with the victim and telling them this exact story, but instead they're doing it to a white man who probably doesn't even care in the greater scheme of things. So what exactly have we proven to you today? We've proven to you that nation building is something that's important, and we think that post-conflict recovery is the most valuable thing that a post-conflict nation needs to go through. But second, we proved to you that the process of justice is not half as important as the prospect of nation building, because we mitigate a lot of things that say, how there's a need for neutral process and things like that. So for all these reasons, this House opposes.
Thank you very much, the government whip. Congratulations on side of opposition to end this round of substantive speeches. Opposition first.
I first want to make a couple of clarifications. Firstly, we support the Nuremberg trials and Tokyo. We've given examples of how this happens and why it's really likely to happen in the case of Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials, which is how the ICC or even international courts can come in and are likely to come in to prosecute high-ranking and low-ranking officials. But even if low-ranking officials aren't prosecuted, I think they have a good reason to not be prosecuted. Because oftentimes in Hitler Germany, you will be shot in the head if you have you are seen as someone who defies Hitler, as someone who defies the orders. This means that this is an act of self-defense when they also carry out these acts. We see in court that if I kill someone to protect myself, that is a valid reason of self-defense, which is why the lower ranking officers have a good reason for self-defense in our worst case scenario. Secondarily, they have to defend having two courts on their side of the house as stated by the info slide. This means that double jeopardy has to exist on their side. They have to explain why that is okay. They haven't done so. Firstly, let's talk about fact-finding. They say that more victims and the accused will speak up, but they never proven why that is true to begin with. This is not true because you still feel pressure, for example, as an accused. You will literally be punished by the victims. You will literally be punished by the most emotional individuals. Imagine me killing someone and their family punishing me. Does the accused really feel comfortable to speak up and tell them about the details of each and every detail of how I murdered your mom and how the blood splat in my face? I feel like that is something that the accused is less likely to do in that situation. This means that the ability for them to really fact find is then compromised on their side of the house because the pressure is immense. Sure, maybe the victim will feel more comfortable to share about their struggles, but they're likely to do so anyway on the international court and in the tribunals on our side of the house because they want justice to be served. They want them to be punished. They want the accused to be punished. This means that they have a strong incentive regardless to speak up about all of the crimes that they have endured. This means that on both sides of the house, the ability for you to fact find is symmetrical. Even if it's easier for individuals to speak up on their side of the house, I want to prove that this is something that is bad. Because in a scenario where it's so comfortable for the victims to speak up, there is no cross-examination like what they say. No one is there to ensure what I say is true or not. I don't feel any pressure to give the truth at all. This means that the victims, in order to get more reparation or in the vengeance that they want to give to the accused because they literally killed my mom, that anger is likely to fuse their mind with a lot of irrationality where they're likely to lie, to dramatize the facts, to exaggerate each and every detail. Maybe they just stole my stove, but I would say that they beat me up after stealing my stove. These are instances that are likely to happen which are going to crowd out real justice to happen because it is true that they killed someone perhaps, but perhaps it is also true that they were forced to do so. This means that justice is really important and their side of the house crowds out justice. No, thank you. Why is this so important in this debate? Because they concede that the end outcome of fact-finding is to achieve justice so that we have more information, so that we can prosecute them better in court, so that we can better have the closure because justice is served. But they compromise justice on their side of the house because individuals are likely to lie in these courts and these lies are likely to be used to prosecute individuals. They compromise any form of real justice and this is unlikely to lead to the real closure that they want to bring onto. I feel like this is something that is bad because insofar as real justice is not achieved, you don't get any form of reasonable nation building. Why is this the case? Because you're likely to feel that it is unfair. Let's assume that it is fair. But people are going to think that it is unfair. You, as the victim, is going to think that why is such a not harsh punishment being enacted because you feel that they are forgiven just because they apologize. No matter whether it's fair or not, the victims will feel as if it's not enough. The reparations are not enough. They literally killed my mom. How could you do anything to pay back for my mom's death? My mom is literally gone. They will feel betrayed by their own people at that point, feeling even more dismantled and feeling even more disillusioned on their side of the house. The accused will feel that it is unfair because you're literally being prosecuted by the victims. That is literally unfair because you know that they're emotional. You know that they're being unfair to you. This is really, really bad because this compromises on your ability to work with each other in the future because the hate is funneled even more on their side of the house because now you feel as if the other side have wronged you on top of what's initially happening. The counterfactual is on our side. where someone impartial, perhaps the ICC, is going to make this decision. This is a lot better because you're more likely to buy this decision, even if you feel a bit of disconnect. That disconnect is something that is good because you know that they are probably impartial. This means that people are more likely to work together to nation build on our side of the house. Someone else is better than your enemy judging you. I think this is something very intuitive. They cannot argue that just because you're closer to like the people, you're going to have more like belief in the like decision. Yes, I'll take your point.
How many victims can you empower in an overseas ICC court as opposed to a local Gacaca court?
I think you can like empower a lot of victims. Like these courts have a lot of funding, so you're going to have a lot of like processes that go through. But even if not, we can have like local courts separate from like the separate from the executive, so that like this can exist as well, like what we see in South Africa, for example. We just don't want it to be a one-sided court where like you have the victims themselves prosecuting everyone. We need a partial system with individuals with like legal training who are able to distance themselves from like the issue itself. So at the end of this debate, I don't think they get a lot of information on their side of the house because we still have fact-finding on our side of the house. We still have measures to protect victims and encourage them to speak up by making them more comfortable in court. For example, like putting them in a separate room and using cameras to encourage them to speak up. We're likely to have the same amounts of information on our side of the house. I don't think they get the benefits of fact-finding. But even if they do get more facts, the facts are false to begin with, which this just like doesn't prove the point of like getting more justice on their side of the house. They don't get there at the end of the day.
Thank you very much to the opposition whip. That concludes the substantive speeches. Moving on to replies, starting with the opposition reply speaker.
Panel, justice is the most important thing in this debate. It is the sense of fairness of knowing that people who have actually committed the crime are punished for what they have done. It gives legitimacy to the new government and the long-term buy-in from states, particularly both the community of the victims and the community of the perpetrators, and it's the foundation of community building. So if this team wants to argue reconstruction post-war is particularly important, we argue it is only because the courts are seen as legitimate and this process has seemed to have garnered a degree of justice that you are likely to have this community building moving forward. You're not going to have nation building not just without justice, but without the perception of justice, which is why it's important the process be removed from the community. Courts are very good in getting justice. Courts are non-exclusive. Both sides of the house has them, which means both sides of the house are likely to have this degree of justice. So the question is, what is the additional value that this particular community courts adds? They tell us in WHIP that lower officers are not charged in our side. Just not clear why this is true. Sue Pei tells you that they probably will be. Maybe they'll be punished a little bit less, but that's fair, right? And only courts are able to adjudicate that if you're a lower soldier that wasn't particularly responsible for the genocide of 2 million. And this is important because you want to have the families and the communities of those soldiers come to the table to rebuild your nation as well. So if you punish them very harshly and very unfairly and they don't come to the table, then you again do not have that community reconstruction in the future. Even if some of these officers are lost out, I think the higher ranking officers are still charged. They're the most responsible, and I still think that they are the people that we need to target the most. The second thing they say is that you have information and stories because apparently in OP, people can destroy evidence and hide names. Again, it's not clear to me why this is true. They haven't given us analysis why. The destruction of evidence is the crime, right? And if the courts can find evidence that you destroyed evidence, then they can charge you as well, which is an incentive for them not to do this. We flip this as well down the bench by showing that courts are actually better because you can compel discovery and subpoena people. You can cross-check victim testimony to ensure what they're talking about has some validity and truth. And even if that's not the case, in World War II, you have Anne Frank that released a diary that really detailed and documented her entire experience throughout the war. So even if you don't have this community process, there are a variety of different ways that victims can share their stories around the world. And these stories, together with the court process, was key in getting a lot of the reparations that post-Nazi Germany had to pay in today's day and age. Lastly, then we'll question, assuming that they get some exclusive stories on their side, what value does this information offer? We questioned whether the perpetrators were going to tell the truth. We told them they had every incentive to diminish their role in this particular tragedy. We told them there was questions about the credibility of the community who were trying them. We told you that their testimony could be used against them in later tribunals and court processes down the road. We then questioned the willingness of this community to make a fair decision. Given the context of the post-conflict state that we characterized right from the LO, it is deeply unlikely that the community will respond well to a perpetrator that said, "I'm sorry for killing 2 million of your family members. Will you please forgive me?" It is deeply unclear why the community will want to do something like that and want to reach a constructive outcome. What this shows basically is that the additional stories and information that side of the house unearthed through the community process is not just unvaluable, it is actively harmful to the reconstruction process of the country. The best case from their side, when they do get some of these exclusive stories, the sharing and trauma re-raises these tensions, dragging up past skeletons out of the closet. You now involve children who may not have been part of this process before in the past, all of which makes it incredibly difficult for the nation to move forward and to have a stable country. In the weighing here, I think at the end of the day, the perception of fairness is required. And if this means that we leave the communities who are most affected by this travesty out of the justice process, that's what we're going to do. We're very proud to oppose.
Right, thank you very much to the opposition speaker. For not the least, to reply on each side of proposition and to end this round of debate, government reply.
I think we've reached a new low in debating where they argued that victims of genocide would lie about the things that they go through. Obviously, this is never the case. People who have been oppressed, people who have been stolen stoves from, probably have been stolen a lot more from as well. We think that all evidence is good evidence and all evidence should be tabled in court, and the only mechanism to achieve this evidence is through the Gacaca court system. I have two call-outs. The first is I'm still unsure about what is Ops' main problem with. Is it that emotion is bad and therefore people get over-punished? Or is it that our system is too lenient and therefore people get under-punished? Which one is it? Are you against over-punishing or are you against under-punishing? And if you are against either of these things, what is considered fair punishment on that side of the house? Because they rely on the same exact courts that we do. So to buy this clash, they needed to assess what is quantify what is justice, and I don't think they've been able to do that. The second thing is on the pivot, right? There's a clear pivot, I just want to call it out. Because their case, when IPO, their case is contingent on the impartiality of courts, because they themselves defend local courts as well that are also compromised. And then they just said, no, we actually defend the ICC. So they just straight up K-shape, U-turn, drive straight into defending a model that they didn't even argue in first. Because if they argued the ICC first, I would have had so many arguments about how the ICC is horrible and does not enforce its policies. I would have talked about how the Tokyo trials had people who have experimented on Chinese people and never got adequate punishment. But I didn't do that because they didn't argue the ICC in first, and this is obviously very, very late. But the second reason why they pivoted is because they knew their analysis on Gacaca court systems being compromised are symmetrical. Like, Op also suffers from the same harms. Sure, they could mitigate it as much as they can. Judges are separate, they are impartial. But at the end of the day, this is a genocide. Everyone is affected. This judge could have had a brother that was killed in the conflict as well. So even if they have safeguards, they are unable to explain how they are able to achieve these safeguards at the end of the day. Both sides of the house defend the court system. Both sides of the house have slightly emotional court systems. And we're arguing from the start, that emotion is actually a benefit. What is the clash that we outright win? And it's on fact-finding. The characterization that was left uncontested is the fact that people, when they are in the cusp of getting captured, they will try their best to burn everything because that results in them having plausible deniability. And this is true, and it was just rebutted in reply that because they just knew that this was going to be damning to their case. And you guys nodded because this is just true, this is reality, this is what happened. So what we're arguing is that fact-finding motivated by emotion in victim testimony results in more questioning, more testimony, more ability for victims to speak out against their oppressors. But more than that, we argued that there's more remorse as well. Because if these people said, I am guilty of this crime, then they're more likely to get a lenient sentence. Their argument was, well, they can have it too. And like in Gov, we argued, how? How are you going to bring these people to the ICC? Are you going to book a flight for them? Are you going to bring them in a train? Like, and even if you could have, you could do these things, I'm unsure as to how many people will do it. Therefore, this debate is then about scale and the amount of facts that we can actually get. At the end of the Gov case, we get more evidence because more people are going to be able to speak out. It doesn't matter if it's a lie. At worst, we get the process of closure for these victims, and at best we can use this evidence in order to persecute the people who are actually part of the organizations that orchestrated the genocide. So even at our worst, we get the victim closure, and at best we get to get justice, which was never a metric in this debate too, but we win it anyway. Thanks.
Thank you very much to the government reply. Thank you to both teams for what was a very great round. I ask for both teams to cross the floor and wait 10 minutes now for deliberation and issue.
Give you 5 minutes.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Last one.